the session. Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Adolfo Garcia. Adolfo is an adjunct professor of neurolinguistics at the University of Cuyo. And he also is director of the Center of Cognitive Neuroscience in the University of San Andres in Buenos Aires. He is also an investigator, associate investigator at the University of Santiago, Chile. He is a director of the Masters in Language and Cognition at the postgraduate program he himself created at the National University of Cuyo. His teaching career includes graduate and postgraduate courses in Argentina, Chile, Colombia, the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, and China. As you can see, everybody wants a piece of Adolfo. He published about 190 papers, chapters, books. He has authored more than 220 presentations and speeches at international academic meetings. And so it is virtually impossible to make a short and complete presentation of Adolfo. So without more ado, the word is yours, Adolfo. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andre, and thanks to Marco and the whole organizing team. What a fantastic event! What a joyous occasion to talk about some of the topics that are perhaps not given all the attention that they really require. And when I received your invitation first back in the day, I mean, so many years ago, this was long overdue. I was so excited to have a chance to exercise my philosophical demons in a way. As a cognitive neuroscientist, I spend most of my days working on experimental studies, looking at data, thinking about analysis and things like that. And I have to say that sometimes going back to thinking about the very basics, the very conceptual, notional basis of what we are doing is something that I miss. So I take this in a very selfish way as an opportunity to indulge myself. I'm going to share my screen, and I'll try to tell you a little bit more about why I'm saying this. The title of my talk is First and Third Person Paradigms for Second Person Disorders. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the tensions that we have when we think about what we typically do in trying to understand certain deficits, certain impairments, and the neurological correlates of those impairments in particular neurological populations who may be well set to present mainly with second person disorders. And still, I believe that we are always sort of going roundabouts about the very core of those difficulties and leveraging other type of paradigms. So let me try to bring this down to earth a little bit. I guess that the main field in which everything that I'm going to be telling you about today can be found is behavioral neurology. This is an interdisciplinary field which has, of course, like every other field, many goals, but I guess that at its core, it is interested in understanding the symptoms and signs of different neurological, including neurodegenerative conditions for diagnostic, prognostic, phenotyping, and monitoring purposes. And typically what you do is you observe a certain pattern of behavior, like what you have here, whether a certain group or patient has a deficit in one domain or category of interest, and whether that maps onto particular patterns of brain alteration. That is, if we have to put it in a oversimplistic nutshell, the very core of behavioral neurology to pursue all these aims. Now, among the very vast gamut of disorders that fall within the purview of behavioral neurology, some of them, I think, can be rightfully conceived as second-person disorders. What do I mean by this? Think about behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. Think about Huntington's disease. Think about cerebellar ataxia. In some of these disorders, what I'm going to say is more prominent, or perhaps not as prominent, but all of them involve some sort of disintegration of the dynamics of the second person. How to behave directly when you're addressing someone else. How what you are expected to say and what you're not expected to say. Whether you can recognize emotions in that other person. Whether you can empathize with that person. Whether you can infer what that person is thinking. Whether you can abide by social norms in your behavior, and whether you are disinhibited and do things that are really off the playbook. All of these things are part of the key constellation of symptoms that characterize these disorders. Let me give you one concrete example, and perhaps this is the prime example. Behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. This is the most prominent, the most prevalent form of frontotemporal dementia. There's a spectrum of neurodegenerative disorders that are contained within the label of frontotemporal lobar degeneration. And the majority of patients exhibit this particular syndrome, behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. If we follow current diagnostic criteria, a person needs to present at least 3 of the following symptoms as a primary sign to merit this diagnosis. Disinhibition, mainly manifested in interpersonal disinhibition and the performance of socially inadequate behavior that you would normally try to suppress. Compulsion, the performance of iterative and repetitive behaviors. Apathy, lack of emotional resonance towards usually engaging and arousing events, especially interpersonal communication. Hyperorality, loss of empathy, a deficit in really being able to resonate with what's happening to another person, together with executive deficits in the context of preserved memory and visual spatial functions. Now, think about this. Many of these things really impinge on the way in which you deal with another, in the way in which you address and you communicate with another person. The interesting thing here is that when you think about this, and if you say, okay, many of the patterns of behavior that typify this disease and others that I will be discussing today have to do with disruptions in which how you conceive of what is right and what is not right, or how you regulate what you do directly in the presence of another interactant. When you think about the paradigms that we use to understand this syndrome, you will see that we are always avoiding somehow a direct tapping into the second person. What we do is we leverage tasks that require first and third person judgment and responses. So you bring a participant to your laboratory or to your examination office, and sometimes you present that person with images of other individuals or sequences of photographs or videos or some type of prompt, and you ask the person to indicate how that person is feeling, how the protagonist or the face or that individual that is presented on the screen typically is feeling, how you rate the emotion that that person is experiencing, how you would rank the level of punishment that a certain person would deserve because of the actions that he or she has engaged in. When you think about this, you are framing the participant in a spectatorial role, in a role in which that person is being required explicitly by task instructions to say something about a third party, not directly to the examiner, but about a third party. And the other type of paradigm that we use requires first-person judgments. When you directly ask the person, how do you feel about this? You present a scenario, you present a situation in which there may be a moral transgression, in which there may be a situation that may be construed to elicit envy or some other type of moral emotion. And then you ask the person, how do you feel? And this is the standard toolkit with which we approach these disorders. So what I would like to do today is basically two things. I'd like to describe these first and third person paradigms that we use. I'd like to present some of the results that we have obtained with them. And I would like them to use those empirical findings as a substrate for a discussion about how relevant these types of analysis are to inform us about the second person dynamics and disruptions that truly typify these disorders, and whether we can even think about feasible ways of really delving into the second person disorders by creating what we might think of as second person paradigms. So this is the roadmap that I have prepared for today. I would like to first address tasks that require verbal identification of emotions in third parties. Then I would like to discuss other paradigms that require participants to judge the intensity, the degree in which they experience certain moral emotions, in which they themselves experience. I would like then to introduce a novel paradigm through which we are capturing or trying to capture deficits in the comprehension of social concepts embedded in naturalistic narratives. And then I would like us all to think together about a few questions regarding the relevance or irrelevance, usefulness or lack thereof, the epistemological directness, or again, lack thereof, of this approach to trying to characterize these second person disorders. So let me begin by discussing tasks that require verbal identification of emotions. This has long been the very backbone of the study of emotions in cognitive science, in social and affective cognitive neuroscience, and related fields. Basically, this is the typical task, and this picture that you're seeing there actually comes from the gold standard set of stimuli that is used in the field, the so-called Ekman phases, in reference to Paul Ekman, who several decades ago introduced this distinction between 6 basic emotion categories. And basically what you do in these tasks is you present participants with still pictures like this one, and then you present a set of verbal labels naming the emotions that Ekman considered basic: happiness, surprise, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, and then a neutral one. But what are you asking the participants to do here? You're asking the participant to tell you what emotion is that person experiencing. you're not asking the participant to tell you which emotion you are experiencing. So you are really framing the participant in a third person spectatorial view. This task is part of the mini C, which is a small battery that has proven quite sensitive to capturing early deficits in behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia and many other disorders. And it includes this facial emotional recognition task that I just introduced, and also a faux pas test, which is basically a test in which you present a very short story in which you describe an interaction between two people such that one person says something that is very inadequate. So in this case, for example, there's a lady who just moved to a new apartment, and she purchased new drapes for her bedroom. She installs the drapes, and then her friend, Elisa, shows up. The first lady very proudly gives her the tour of the apartment, and she says, "Do you like my bedroom?" And Elisa says, "Well, those drapes are just terrible. I imagine you're going to buy new ones." So this is a faux pas, right? This is something you said that was socially inadequate. And then you ask the participant to say, to answer these questions. Did anybody say something inadequate here? If so, who said it? Why did that person say it? What is that person thinking? How do you think the other person felt? So again, notice that this is another third person paradigm. You are requiring judgments about what happened to a third party that you had a sort of second order view of, without being directly involved in the situation. Now, these tasks have proven very, very sensitive to capturing early deficits in different neurodegenerative disorders. In this recent work from our group, we showed that the performance in these tasks contributes very, very importantly to discriminating between behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia patients and healthy controls. And it is the only measure that contributes to identifying Parkinson's disease patients in early disease stages amid a constellation of different cognitive measures. This task did not prove to be so relevant for discriminating between Alzheimer's disease patients and healthy controls, which is interesting too, because it means that it does have some level of specificity. It's not that any type of neurodegeneration will affect how you perform on this task. This means that only certain neurodegenerative diseases seem to affect this. And the interesting thing too is that performance in this task is correlated with different neural hubs in BVFTD and in Parkinson's disease. Although in both cases, you have this task as eliciting significant differentiations between the patients and controls, the neural mechanisms that are involved in those patterns of deficit are very different between those disorders. Another thing that we've done with this task is to show the relevance even beyond neurodegenerative conditions. For example, here, we've worked with patients with hypertensive heart disease. And the idea is that when you are going through a certain emotional state, your arousal, those patterns that typify an emotion, they involve basically particular configurations of your autonomic nervous system. And we reasoned, okay, if emotions are contingent on the integrity of our autonomic nervous system, and in particular between the dialogue between that system and neurocognitive systems, we might expect that people with hypertensive heart disease should exhibit deficits in this task. And what we found is precisely that. Compared with normal tensives, that is to say, people without heart hypertension, patients with this condition have significant emotional processing deficits. They also have interoceptive deficits. They find it harder to keep track of their own inner states. In this case, they find it hard to keep track of their heart dynamics. And this is another interesting thing. When you take a look at the relationship between your capacity to monitor your inner states and your emotional recognition, in healthy participants, you have a significant association. The better you are at recognizing your own bodily dynamics, your own internal dynamics, the better you are at recognizing emotions in others. This association is abolished in the hypertensive patients, which shows that the interface between emotion recognition, third-party judgments of emotion, and the tracking of your own first-person bodily dynamics can be particularly disturbed by both in this case, by the alteration of your cardiac patterns. I was getting ahead of myself because I was going to say by both your cardiac dynamics and by both, and as well as your neural dynamics. And in fact, we found that in patients with neurodegenerative disorders, in particular behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, this link between your interoception, your capacity to monitor your first-person bodily dynamics, and the recognition of emotions in others is also affected. What we did in this study was to do a very simple paradigm in which we had participants recognize emotions in two conditions. First, after they spent a lot of time monitoring their inner signals, their cardiac dynamics. We put them in an interoceptive state before they judged emotions. And in the other condition, we asked them to listen externally through their ears to someone else's heart, and then to judge emotions. So we have an interoceptive condition. You monitor your own cardiac activity and then you judge emotions, and then an exteroceptive condition. You listen to someone else's heart, not your own, and then you judge emotions. What we found was that in healthy participants, when you spend time in this interoceptive state, when you spend conscious time tracking your own bodily dynamics, you become better at recognizing emotions, third-party emotions. However, in patients with behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, that doesn't happen. There's no benefit, there's no boosting of your emotion recognition capacity after you've spent time monitoring your own inner cardiac dynamics. And this is accompanied by distinct alterations of neural markers of interoception, such as the heart-evoked potential. And I don't want to go into details about the neurophysiological aspects of this. I'll be very happy to answer those questions, but I just want to focus on the important thing here. If you think about the previous study and then this one, what we are showing is that both the integrity of your brain and the integrity of your heart, your own brain and your own heart impinge on how good or not you are at judging third-party emotions, at judging emotions in other people. And this is interesting to see that any of the two main components in your neurovisceral or your neurocardiac dynamics, be it the brain or the heart, the alteration of any of those two components can disrupt not only their link, but also the way in which you can engage in this core socio-cognitive capacity that is judging emotions. So that's the first line of work I wanted to share with you. And again, and I will be repeating myself, what I want you to keep particularly in mind is that we are tracking these deficits in patients that are typified by second-person disorders, but we are orbiting around the real core of the issue. In another type of studies, we are asking participants to judge the intensity of certain moral emotions. The emotions that we were just looking at, happiness, anger, disgust, they are typically called basic emotions. But and many of them, I should say all of them, are to some extent shared with other non-human species. They are part of our evolutionary history. But as humans, we have developed a very complex type of emotions that really hinge on the interpersonal and social dynamics that are exclusive to our species. Think about envy, for example. Yeah, when someone is going through a very positive state, and you feel somehow bad about that. You feel bad because someone else is feeling good. It's a very stupid and simplistic way of putting it, but I want to do it like this on purpose because it's the simplest way of getting yourself into this construct, which may be new to perhaps some of the people in the audience, which is that of Schadenfreude, which is a German term that refers to a particular moral emotion whereby you feel good because the other person is doing bad. Basically, Schadenfreude is the pleasure that you derive upon witnessing someone else's misfortune. And I don't know how much you are into Argentine soccer here, but if you know about Boca and River, you know that those are the main two soccer teams. And of course, they really hate each other. And what you see here is the fans of Boca being particularly ecstatic when River lost their category, when they were pushed down to the second division because they did so poorly during a sequence of championships. This is Schadenfreude. The best thing that can happen to a Boca fan is for Boca to win the championship. The second best thing that can happen to a Boca fan is that River loses the championship, and that's Schadenfreude. In this task, we created specific stimuli aimed to elicit envy and Schadenfreude. And I want you to pay attention to the structure of the task. We bring participants to the laboratory. We sit them facing a computer, and they see a face, and they first learn some information about this person, so that you create a positive bond with that person or a negative bond with that person. And then you say something like this: this person, who maybe you don't like, gets a better test score because he was the cousin of the professor. And then you ask, how much displeasure do you feel for this situation? And you have to choose a number between 1, which is little, to 9, a lot. Now think about the second situation, aimed to elicit Schadenfreude. This person, he was excluded from his group of friends because he's a liar. And how much pleasure do you feel for this situation? How much pleasure do you feel because he did poorly, from 1 to 9? Again, we are asking patients and controls to judge this about a third party. These tasks, they are remarkably sensitive as well. Think about Huntington's disease. This is a neurodegenerative condition which is typified by movement disorders, but together with a constellation of psychiatric symptoms that affect socio-cognitive skills. Patients usually present apathy. They find it hard to recognize basic emotions. They have alterations in cognitive and affective dimensions of empathy. And the interesting thing here is there are two or three things that I would like to mention. First, when you assess Schadenfreude and envy in patients with Huntington's disease, you observe that the patients have selective deficits in their experience of Schadenfreude. They find it selectively hard to feel pleasure at someone else's misfortune. There are no differences in their experience of envy relative to that of healthy controls. But then the second piece of information that's very clinically useful here, or potentially so at least, is the following. Huntington's disease is an autosomic disorder. What does this mean? There's a man with Huntington's disease and a woman without Huntington's disease, or the other way around, a woman with Huntington's disease and a man without Huntington's disease. They get together, they have offspring, they have a son or a daughter, and that son or daughter will have literally a 50% chance of developing Huntington's disease. If they inherit chromosome 4 from the parent with Huntington's disease, they will develop Huntington's disease. This is not probabilistic. And the interesting thing is that here we also evaluated relatives of the patients, their sons and daughters, first-degree relatives who had no symptoms of the disease. They were 10 years younger than the patients were. And in these participants who were healthy, but we know that they have genetic risk of developing the disease, we also find a selective deficit in Schadenfreude. This is quite interesting because it suggests that these tasks may, and I really want to emphasize the may here, they may be preclinically sensitive. They may be able to capture patterns of deficit when the core symptoms that you need to observe to diagnose someone with Huntington's disease are not there yet. But when you know that the pattern of neurodegeneration that typifies this disease has probably already begun. And then another interesting thing is that we found that the performance in this Schadenfreude task correlates significantly with the volume of the ventral striatum. This is a core region that is affected by Huntington's disease and has been implicated in a variety of socio-cognitive processing, including moral processing. Now, again, notice that we are asking the participants to judge how someone else feels. We are not asking the participants to say, do you feel envy relative to me, the examiner? We are not asking them to interact directly with another participant. We are, again, sort of beating around the bush, if you will. We found the very same pattern, selective deficits in Schadenfreude with preservation of envy in Parkinson's disease patients, which shows that this task may actually be transdiagnostically useful, meaning that it may be useful and particularly sensitive to disturbances in different neurodegenerative disorders. Even more so, we have extended the transdiagnostic sensitivity of this task to other neurodegenerative conditions, such as behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, as well as Alzheimer's disease. The interesting thing here is that in behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, you don't have that selectivity in which only Schadenfreude is affected. Both Schadenfreude and envy show disturbances. And the same thing happens in Alzheimer's disease. The interesting thing is that the neural correlates of those alterations are different in each disorder. But again, we are deriving clinical information and potentially candidate markers of these diseases somehow in the periphery of the actual nature and core of their disturbances. And I want to introduce now the latest paradigm that we have developed to capture these alterations in socio-affective processing. We have been working from an embodied cognition perspective, which I will assume will not be new at all for many of you, but let me just give you a couple of highlights to frame the discussion. Let's say that you come back home after a long day of a philosophy congress, especially with an Argentine guy that's speaking very late at night about second-person disorders, and there's a cheese, there's a slice of cheese there sitting on the table, and the moment you open the door, you recognize the smell. Oh, that's the cheese, and you can recognize the intensity of the smell. You can even tell what type of cheese it is. If you're able to do those things, it is to a large extent because of the workings of what we might call olfactory brain circuits. That is to say, beyond your nose and your nostrils and the chemical processes that take part there, your olfactory world hinges on the activity of this widely distributed network, which has key hubs in certain neural regions, such as the orbitofrontal cortex, the piriform cortex, the amygdala, and the thalamus. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because when you think about how you process conceptual information, language in this case, you will find that these circuits are engaged by particular word types. In this study by Gonzalez and colleagues, dating back 15 years, they introduced healthy participants in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and they presented participants with two types of words. On the one hand, olfactory words, words with strong olfactory associations, cinnamon, cheese, vanilla, poop, maybe. And then on the other hand, words with no predominant or systematic olfactory associations, circle, square, triangle. And what they did was they observed the patterns of brain activation when people were reading the olfactory words. Then they measured the patterns of brain activation when people were reading the non-olfactory words, and they compared both. And what they found was that the olfactory words involved increased activation patterns in many hubs of the olfactory circuit. This is embodied cognition at its basic, at least in the language domain. The sensory experiences that are evoked by the words reenact, recycle, engage the very circuits that mediate your sensory experience that the words are alluding to. We have shown, and many labs have done it, the same thing for action-related words. So when you have words that involve bodily movement, such as jump, run, clap, applaud, punch, things that involve moving your body, what you observe is that there's a significant increase of activation in your motor cortices, the same regions that allow you to physically jump, run, punch, and so on. And in this study, actually, we showed that those reactivations of motor circuits evoked by action-related words are primary. They are seminal. They are germinal. They occur roughly 120 or 150 milliseconds after you perceive that word, meaning that this is not something that happens epiphenomenically, that happens after you have engaged in more typical conceptual processing, but it's something that lies at the very onset of your construal of meaning when you are processing a word. In fact, when you take a look at when there's a significant distinction between action and non-action words in regions that are more canonically associated with complex multimodal conceptual processing, you find that the distinction occurs much later. So the bottom line here is that the reactivation of non-primarily linguistic circuits by certain lexicosemantic categories is significant, and it is primary. It is part of the foundations through which our brain can construe meaning when we are faced with language. And I say faced, and we've shown that this also happens with face-related words. Here we had a chance to work with participants who have refractory epilepsy and who are undergoing intracranial surgery. And to that end, they have electrodes implanted directly within their brains. These are microelectrodes. You can think about it as sort of neural acupuncture with very, very thin needles implanted directly inside the brain. And we have patients who had brain needles implanted directly inside their face processing regions, the brain mechanisms that are specialized for processing human faces. And then other electrodes implanted in more typical conceptual processing regions. And we presented these participants with face-related words nose, face, mouth, cheeks, and non-face related words, denoting other body parts, chest, shoulder, hand. And what we found was that the face-related circuits, they were very significantly and very early on modulated by face-related words. In other, to put it in different terms, when you are reading a face-related words, what part of what happens in your brain is that those words quickly reactivate your face processing mechanisms. They evoke, they recruit the very same mechanisms that are involved in mediating your nonverbal experience that the words allude to. Why am I saying all this? Because we've been working a lot on this line of research, especially focusing on movement disorders, but now we are interested in taking this to the domain of second person disorders. And we created this paradigm. We constructed social texts. These are texts that are very rich in their depiction of interpersonal events. In these stories, which are, this is one of them, by the way, which are very simple. You always have 2 or 3 characters, protagonists, engaging in social situations. So here you have things like someone asks someone else for a favor, someone explains the situation and offers money. This person wants to help him. This guy accepts a task. He rejects payment. Kindly, he insists, and then he gives him the money, but the guy returns it gently. So there's the focus is placed on interpersonal situations, how 2 people interact with one another. These texts, they are, if you read them, they have all the requisites of a text, texture. They have multiple relations of coherence and cohesion. They have unfolding semantic relations. They are short stories, which may not be worthy of a Pulitzer Prize, but they are naturalistic texts. And this sets them apart from the typical isolated word studies that we do at the lab. And then we have questionnaires in which we ask participants questions about the texts, and so that we can measure how much they understood in those texts. Just like we have a social text, we have non-social texts. In those non-social texts, there's always a single person who's not interacting socially with anybody else. They're alone somewhere, and they're doing things on their own, preparing coffee, sitting on the couch, maybe reading a book, but there's no social interaction whatsoever. What the participants don't know is that these texts, although they look so naturalistic, and they are texts in the full sense of the term, they have been constructed very, very, very carefully, so that the social text and the non-social text are statistically matched along many, 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 many variables. The number of characters, words, and nouns, as well as the frequency, familiarity, imageability, syllabic length, graphemic length, the number of and types of sentences, the grammaticality, the coherence, the comprehensibility, the readability, they're all matched between the texts. They differ, if we did things right, only, or at least primarily, in that one evokes socio-affective meanings and the other one doesn't. So let me go here. We have been working with this task, and we have results that we are very, very excited to share with you and everybody. We have been working on the cerebellum. The cerebellum is this relatively small structure that's embedded on the bottom of your brain, but it's particularly complex and poorly understood. Despite its relatively small size, it contains more than half of the neurons of the entire brain. And it has been typically implicated in motor function, in movement, in the sequencing of motion, in balance. But increasingly, in recent years, many works have shown that this brain region plays a particular role in social cognition, including your capacity to recognize emotion, to empathize with other people, to understand how people interact and things like that. So we conducted the very first study of social concept comprehension in naturalistic texts in patients with selective atrophy of the cerebellum. We recruited healthy controls and patients with cerebellar ataxia, which is a disorder that's typified by early and progressive atrophy of the bilateral cerebellum. We conducted neuropsychological assessments, and then here's the beauty of this. We administered the social text. They listened to the social text and they responded to the questionnaire, and the non-social text, and they responded to the questionnaire. And then we obtained brain imaging. What we found is that the patients with cerebellar damage, they had deficits in their comprehension of the social text, but no deficits in their comprehension of the non-social text, which reinforces this particular link of the cerebellum relative to your socio-cognitive skills. Now, another interesting thing is that we found that the patient's atrophy pattern was confined to the cerebellum. It was not widespread across the brain. It was cerebellar atrophy in particular. And then here's another interesting thing. In healthy control, the connectivity between the cerebellum and other socio-cognitive regions was correlated significantly and positively with social text comprehension. The greater the connectivity between the cerebellum and these other cortical regions, the greater the understanding of the social text. This is in healthy participants. Conversely, when you take a look at what happens in the cerebellar ataxia patients, that association is abolished. There's no association. So this again suggests that this third-party emotion concept comprehension task based on naturalistic texts may capture selective deficits in patients typified by second-person disorders. But again, we are opting for a third-person approach to this. And the final thing I'd like to share with you today in terms of empirical findings is this study, which will be very soon published in cerebral cortex, in which we administered the social text and the non-social text with their corresponding questionnaires to behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia patients, this disorder that I've been telling you about since the beginning, and healthy controls, but also to neurodegenerative control groups, Parkinson's disease patients and Alzheimer's disease patients. And the interesting thing here is that for behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, these second-person interpersonal interaction deficits are primary diagnostic deficits. They are the main thing that distinguish this syndrome, but that's not the case for Parkinson's disease, which is mainly a movement disorder. And that's not mainly the case for Alzheimer's disease, which is primarily typified by episodic and semantic memory deficits. So we hypothesized that if the comprehension of social information is actually embodied, and it depends on the integrity of your socio-cognitive brain networks, then you should expect selective deficits in social text comprehension only in behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia patients. That is to say, those patients that are typified by socio-affective disturbances as their primary alteration, and by disturbances of the brain networks and circuits that are implicated. So this is what we did. And then we implemented a multimodal neuroscientific protocol, including structural imaging, functional brain imaging, and high-density electroencephalography. What we found is the following. Compared with healthy participants, only the behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia patients had selective deficits in social text comprehension. That is to say, this group, they had deficits in comprehending the social text, but not in comprehending the non-social text. When you take a look at Parkinson's disease, you find the exact opposite. They were preserved in their comprehension of social text, but they were impaired in their comprehension of the non-social. When you Alzheimer's disease patients who have semantic memory problems pervasively, you find that they have deficits in both texts, probably because of their memory deficits, which make it difficult for them to remember information from any type of text. Now, so we have here something that is sort of a third-person task that seems capable of capturing selective deficits in a second-person disorder. And the interesting thing is that those deficits in the behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia patients significantly correlated with anatomo-functional alterations in key hubs of social networks in the brain. The same regions that you see involved in the capacity to experience empathy and Schadenfreude and to recognize emotions, they were significantly associated with their capacity or incapacity to comprehend information in the social text. So here we have another interesting tool whereby third-person socio-affective tasks seem to be tapping into some aspect of what is essentially a second-person socio-cognitive disorder. So, in a nutshell, first and third-person paradigms, I believe, help us characterize second-person disorders. If the evidence that I introduced today is robust, and we would like to believe that it is the case, then you find in these first and third-person paradigms tools that can help you detect these diseases early on, that might be sensitive to their onset in preclinical, non-symptomatic stages. You find tools that may help you to differentiate between different disorders. You have tools that seem to allow you to tap into the structural and functional integrity of disease-specific brain circuits. However, to what extent do these findings really illuminate second-person experiences? We are never asking participants to tell us something about the interlocutor directly. We are not exposing participants to a direct face-to-face confrontation, dialogue, exchange with the examiner, which is ultimately the other living party in the experiments. What is more, we could perhaps be asking the participants to recognize emotion, to say, tell that person that you're seeing on the screen what he is feeling or what she's feeling, but that's not what we do. Another question that we have is, can second-person experiences then be reported as such unless the addressee is the second person in question? That is to say, do we even have a way of tapping directly into second-person alterations in the typical laboratory setting unless you create a whole new conception of how you elicit responses from the patients and the participants, such that they have to interact directly with you as an examiner? And what would be the implications of that? Would it make sense? Would we want to do it? Would the trade-off between potential empirical gains and ethical hindrances be worth the effort? And are vicarious social cognition tasks, such as the faux pas test that we saw before, second-order windows into second-person experiences? When you ask someone to tell you, hey, this person said something that may be inadequate, are you asking them to sort of place themselves in the shoes of that protagonist in the story so that they imagine what it is like to be the first person participant of that interaction? Are we creating this second order sort of delegated ways, these sort of avataristic ways of assessing actual second person experiences? Or are we just, and again, relying on third and first person paradigms to tap into what are essentially second person disorders? These are the questions that I would like to end with. And I hope that in addition to the questions you may have about the experiments that I presented, that I can profit from the shared philosophical expertise that we have here to reflect these questions and think about what their implications might be on theoretical, meta-theoretical, methodological, and otherwise translational ways. It was my privilege to have the opportunity to share these findings with you today, but of course, all of this is the product of a phenomenal team that I have the honor to work with at the Cognitive Neuroscience Center at Universidad de San Andrés. And also, many of these results stem from the many multinational associations that we have. And I would just like to briefly acknowledge the contributions of the Red Lab Consortium, the Global Brain Health Institute, IBM Research, and Universidad de Antioquia. And if you want to learn more about the work that we do in these lines, please don't be shy and come visit our website of the Cognitive Neuroscience Center at Universidad de San Andrés, or even my personal website, so you can learn a little bit more about these topics that I shared with you today. I really want to thank you for your attention, and I am more than interested in whatever discussion ensues.
Thank you very much, Adolfo. I hope we will have some questions are being up. Felipe Nogueira Carvalho first. Okay, Felipe.
Yeah, thank you, Adolfo. That was great, really cool stuff. Really, thank you for sharing with us. It's really exciting, to hear this. Like, it makes me like wish I were a scientist sometimes, because it just be so exciting just to find this stuff out. So thank you for sharing. And I think like you raised some really important questions at the end. And my first thoughts upon hearing these questions, like, yeah, I think actually there might be reasons to doubt that in these kinds of tests, you're actually probing to second-person perspectives and experiences. And what I'm thinking of here, are you familiar with there's a ESS paper by Schubach and colleagues. It's called Towards a Second-Person Neuroscience. I don't know if you know about that, but they say, like, they present like tons of studies and evidence and say, like, well, when people are actually interacting with someone, you get completely different results, like different patterns of activation, different behavioral results. It doesn't have to be like a real world interaction. Even if you have a computer and the computer just looks back at you and like follows your gaze somewhat, you already get different results. So if what they're saying is true, then there might be reason to doubt that you need like actually different kinds of designs and paradigms to study this kind of thing. So just want to hear your thoughts about that.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for bringing that issue into consideration. Of course, I'm well familiar with Schilbach's works, and actually, we have a book coming up next year at some point, which will be the Routledge Handbook of Neurosemiotics, and Leonard actually wrote a chapter in second-person neuroscience for it. So it was a great opportunity to delve deeper into his work. So basically, what you have there is this new perspective. I remember once listening to a talk by Stephen Clark, who said that his lab was the only one in the whole university where he had more than one people at once inside the laboratory. What he did was to observe social dynamics, especially in verbal interaction, as people were doing cooperative things, like putting things together. The second-person neuroscience paradigm is mainly leveraging two types of tasks. One of them, or two paradigms, I should say. One of them is what's known as hyperscanning, which is basically the simultaneous recording of brain activity in two actual living, real-time interacting participants. This has been done, for example, with EEG, two people interacting with EEG looking at each other. This has been done even in fMRI studies, such that you have a camera where you can see the other person's face, and it has been done even in particular games, such that you can see how you react to how the other person is moving the pieces on a board, for instance. Some exciting things have been found whose interpretation is not so straightforward, I should say. For example, something that has been seen is that interpersonal neural synchrony, which is basically more similar patterns of brain activation between interacting people, can be observed when people are talking face to face and when they're talking back to back. There's something about the presence of the face, not just the presence of the person, but the direct presence of the face that seems to dictate the extent to which our brains couple in one way or another. And then there are other paradigms in which you don't really need an actual second person. All you need is the illusion that there's a second person there. So you play computer games and you tell them, okay, so you're playing here on the computer, and on the other side, there's another person who's playing against you. There's no such a person. It's actually an algorithm that adjusts its performance to your own performance, right? But it's a good proxy. Yes, that is very exciting. It is tremendously challenging for a number of reasons to interpret those data, to analyze those data. And in any case, I think that what this really, the one thing that this sparks in my mind is the division, or at least the distinction between theoretical and applied aims. And I'm going to frame this as a question. Let's say that the first and third person tasks we are using fail to delve directly into these second person real-time inter-engaging dynamics that social interaction is actually about. Do we even care? If they are sensitive to detect a certain brain disease, should we care? Or on the other way around, what if we are missing out on a lot and we are not capturing even better markers of the diseases because we are beating around the bush? But then there's the theoretical side of things. And that's where I think we have the real problem, because the bulk of socio-affective cognitive neuroscience has been talking about social cognition, placing people in a spectatorial role, asking them to do these things that I showed you, and only very rarely seeing what happens to the human brain when you interact. So I think that you can take a more pragmatic approach where you can tolerate the discrepancy between the tasks that you use and the actual nature of the disorder if they prove clinically useful. But when it comes to theoretical modeling, I think that's when this question becomes more pressing. So these are just the thoughts that come to mind upon hearing your very interesting question, Felipe.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's gave me a lot to think about. That's like the $1 million question, right? Thank you.
I don't have $1 million, if that's what you're asking.
Okay, now Marco, and then Ernesto.
Oh, I had the $1 million question that let me change. Oh, just one thing, Adolfo. I'm really amazed, actually, impressed by all the work you and your colleagues have been doing. It is really impressive. But I mean, I think you guys, you have to, you are smart, very smart, all of you doing neuroscience, the kind of neuroscience you're doing. You have to stop going around the bushes, as you said, and go straight to the second person phenomenon. Find a way, because I think, of course, you can design experiments that are ethical, or that can be done. Because what I feel is the way you go around bushes, basically, let's take the example of the experience of the olfactory experience, smelling the cheese, like in your case. Of course, we know that when you show words like cheese or poop, whatever, that the area that is being activated in the brain is the same that actually is activated when you smell the cheese, but in a minor intensity, that's for sure. I mean, let's take the word toothache. Of course, when I read it, I don't really feel it, right? I don't need a painkiller to read a book on dentistry, right? That's a very minor intensity. So what are you doing is you're trying to measure and to find second person phenomena in the brain, how it's processed, but just kind of getting this mild effect instead of going straight to the real thing. Do you have an example of any experiment that actually shows some real second person thing going on in the brain, or any sort of at least idea of how it could be measured?
That's fantastic. First of all, I'm not so sure that you don't need to have painkillers to go through a dentistry. Look, have you tried it? I mean, unless I think some narcotics are essential to go through such a book.
They probably take some stuff. You're right.
Yeah, but other than that, there's on the one hand, I mean, we haven't done it. We ourselves as a group, our lab, we haven't done it. There's the whole second person neuroscience line that Felipe mentioned. There are more typical studies in social psychology and in some lines of cognitive science, where you can introduce experimental manipulations in actual interaction. There are studies that use what are known as confederates. So basically, you come to the lab, and I tell you, all you have to do is talk to this guy. You know, here's another guy. So you go there, you sit, and you talk, and we will record what you say. What you don't know is that other person is my ally as a researcher, and he has been trained to say specific things, specific words, to use specific syntactic patterns. And then what we are seeing is whether that person can prime you to use specific syntactic patterns, for example, or if he can prime you to lower your voice at certain stretches or things like that. So these things, they have been done. Now, there's a tradition, and I think that the word tradition is very, very important here. And it's one of the double-edged swords of neuroscience. The fact that you have tests like the emotion recognition task that I showed you, that task has been used in, this is no hyperbole, thousands, tens of thousands of studies, the very same phases across many different cultures. The fact that you have the same study, the stimuli, and the same task and the same question that you ask the participants enables you to see which things really cut across culture and socioeconomic status and ages and gender and things like that. So there's something good to be said about this falling back on the tradition tendency that neuroscience has. The bad thing is that sometimes we just keep doing things in a certain way because they have been done that way before. And it's very hard sometimes to really do something and create a new way of doing things. It's not so hard to do one experiment where you try to do things differently, but to create a new line of work where that is subverted, that's very tricky for a number of reasons, ranging from pragmatic to institutional to financial reasons. What do I think about? First, could we use some of the existing two-person neuroscience paradigms that Felipe was mentioning with patients? Yes, that would be very good. It would be a straightforward way of doing this. Second, could we introduce little tweaks in these tasks and perhaps turn them more into something that's more second person oriented? For example, picture this. You have the face on the computer. And if you ask the participant to say, you know, we say, tell me what emotion that person's feeling. What if you ask the participant, tell that person which emotion he is feeling? Would that suffice? I mean, we are now requiring a second person judgment. Now you're talking to the person whose emotion you're seeing, but it's not real social interaction, right? It's still sort of a deflated version of it. But it's something that we could do. And to my knowledge, that hasn't been done. Just comparing the effect that turning the question is, tell me what he's doing, vis-a-vis, tell that person what he's feeling, that might make a difference. These are the things that I'm thinking about, Marco. And there's one more thing that I don't want to leave unmentioned, which is clinical observation. When a neurologist sees this patient in their office, everything is so clear. And they know that the way in which they respond to them is socially inappropriate. It's disinhibited. Hey, that guy just stood up and lowered his pants. That happens, you know, in front of me, the neurologist. So there's also this tension, which is the the tendency of experiments to require third-person judgments, right? The opacity of first-person experience and the sort of historical tradition to avoid second-person judgments. I can think of these things and I can think of these ways of pushing things forward, but to be honest, we haven't acted on them yet.
Okay, Ernesto.
Well, again, thank you very much for your talk. It's very interesting. I have a couple of questions that might result from my ignorance, but here are the questions. The first question is, there are some stuff in psycholinguistics that seem to me to tap into the ability of people to construe common ground. For instance, the choice of words that might be more or less heavy according to the ability they have to calculate the common ground they have with other people. And there are some diseases that impair precisely this sort of ability. Have you thought about using more linguistic-oriented tests, such as the choice of words in patients with those deficits? And do you think that would that be a way to tap precisely into the second-person perspective, the choice of words you have and constructions you have, and to talk to someone else? And the second question is, maybe I think it's the same question that Philippe and Marco have asked. I mean, we all wanted to have more direct second-person experiments. And from another paradigm, the tests that try to identify the age in which children pass the false belief test, there is the age has been lowered once they have changed the kind of test. Instead of asking the children to say whether where will Max look for the chocolate or stuff like that, they try to see where will the infant look before they can talk, and what's the expectation is measured by the eye movement and stuff like that you certainly know or that you are aware of. That seems to suggest that when you have very propositional tests, the cognitive load may be bigger, and that may have an effect on the performance of the subject. Do you think this have an effect on what you're doing? Since you seem to, at least as I understood, you seem to have very propositional loaded tests instead of having, say, measuring the eye movements or priming certain sorts of behaviors. And do you think this might have an effect on the kind of result that you have? And again, thank you very much for your excellent talk.
Thank you very much for these questions, Ernesto. I am a father of a 2.5-year-old toddler, and that takes a toll on my memory, especially at 9:20 p.m. So I will ask you to help me remember the first question. So your first question was?
My first question was, there is I've tried to find it now, but I couldn't. But it seems to me that there are some results showing that people with certain sorts of dementia tend to choose pronouns that are lighter, and failing to. That happened with my grandmother when she was 100-year-old, and I went to see her with my father. And she couldn't find the descriptions to introduce people, and she would just say the now, and people that were dead, 8 years ago, and then my father didn't know who. And I think that she failed to calculate the common ground.
No, that's great. So evidence on these are known as so there's a lot of evidence on category-specific deficits. So, for example, different brain diseases may differentially compromise your capacity to process certain word types. In Parkinson's disease, we've repeatedly shown that patients find it selectively hard to process action verbs, for instance. In the case of Alzheimer's disease, typically nouns are more compromised than verbs early on in the disease. In certain forms of primary progressive aphasia, for example, you have a frequency effect, such that patients find it particularly hard to process low frequency words, but they do quite well with high frequency words, the most common ones. So there's that. The tasks, all the tasks that I present today, they are all receptive tasks. In a way, I mean, they present stimuli, and what you do is you respond to something that you read or heard or were exposed to. Now we are working on more naturalistic settings using natural language processing. So basically, we ask patients to talk to us. And we can ask them about what a typical day of their lives is like. Sometimes we show them pictures and we ask them to describe what the pictures are like. Or we tell them, hey, can you tell me a pleasant memory from your life or an unpleasant memory from your life? We record that. They're just talking spontaneously. There's no constraint. And then we automatically transcribe those recordings. We have written text now, and we can use different natural language processing tools to capture patterns there. We can use graph theory to see if the structure of the texts, for example, are different between patients and controls. We can use morphosyntactic measures to see if the distribution of certain grammatical or morphological patterns are different between the groups. And something that you can do is a subset of analysis that fall within the scope of sentiment analysis. For example, you can try to see whether the weight of emotionally loaded words is significantly different between patients and controls in certain groups. Or you can take a look at prosody as another potential marker of socio-affective engagement and find differentiations there. We are doing that now. And in a way, I haven't thought about it this way till you raised this question. That is a little bit more dialogical, because when you do that, the person is actually talking to the examiner. They're not just engaging in the monologue. I mean, even if the tasks are sort of monological in a way, they are talking to the examiner, and they will ask the examiner, is that correct? Or no, they will ask for visual feedback, and the examiner will sometimes interject something. So I think this might be a way, imperfect, but one way of perhaps delving into these mechanics. And it hadn't occurred to me that there was some second person dimension to this till you raised this question. So I thank you for that. As you might expect, I have no recollection at all about the second question, but you're going to help me there too.
Well, the question concerns the false belief task, which is whether you know the false belief task, whether so and children used to pass the test at when they were 4 years old. And
you
now
are thinking
that they
about
have
the propositional load of the tasks that we are using the cognitive load on. Okay, got it.
Yes.
Yes, the measures that we are using, they are, if you want to call them that, propositionally dense, especially the ones with the naturalistic texts in the end, where participants, they have to listen to these texts. They last on average 100 seconds. That is a little bit over 1.5 minutes, right? And we ask them purposely to listen to the texts with eyes closed. We don't want any visual interference in their experience of the auditory information that they are perceiving. And then we ask the questions that we asked. So something that I should mention here is that we are never taking a look at a text in isolation. As you saw, all the results that I showed were contingent on a comparison between a social text and a non-social text. And if you take a look at all the variables that we control, many, I want to say all, but that's always a lot. Many of the key factors that we know play a role in cognitive load were statistically accounted for. It's not the same thing as saying we know that this is not creating a differential cognitive load, but this is as much as you can do from the perspective of stimulus construction. So at least I think that when you have these manipulations, social text and non-social text, an emotional paragraph and a non-emotional paragraph, if you did things correctly, at least you can partly account for the impact that cognitive load might have. Another thing that we do is we co-vary our results for the patient's performance in executive function tests or domain general cognitive tests. So for example, if you find this distinction, a significant deficit in the social test, and you co-vary that for their working memory deficits or their attentional deficits, and the social text problem still proves significant, then you have some statistical element to say, okay, this is not primarily driven by these more domain general forms of cognitive processing that may impinge on the overall load of the task. So these are the imperfect ways that we have to account for that. It's not ideal, it's incomplete, but at least both in terms of stimulus construction and matching and the co-varying approach, you have two statistical ways of partly accounting for the potential influence of propositional or overall cognitive load.
Okay, any more questions? Allow me to ask a very, oh, Philippe, again.
No, go ahead, because I already asked a question. So I just raised my hand because no one else had one, but go ahead and ask your question first.
Okay, no, it's a very naive question. Adolfo, I understand quite well what is a third person paradigm. All the rich empirical findings that you presented are obtained from a third person paradigm by a team of researchers that share the same interest, same method, and reach the same conclusions. But what would count as a first person paradigm in that description? It is the avowals, the testimony of the patients. Well, that's my question. What would come from first person perspective?
Yes, and you know, I was thinking about this when I was thinking about the title of the talk, and when I was thinking about the framing of it. And I think that the first and the third person, they're always intertwined in these paradigms. So, for example, when you say, how much punishment do you, how happy do you feel about what happened to this person? You're asking about a first person question, how do you feel? How much punishment do you think this person should have? But it's based on your appraisal of a third person action, right? It's very hard, I think, to this, or when you're asking a third person judgment, you know, what is the emotion that this person is perceiving? You're asking that person, what do you think is the emotion that that person is perceiving? So I think that really when you start sort of delving deeper into this, the first and the third person are always intertwined. Sometimes the question that you ask may foreground the first and the third person part of it, but it's very, very hard to really extricate one from the other. But what I know for sure is the second person is sort of lost in action there. But my appraisal here, and I'm talking here more from speculative than an assertive stance, is that it's very hard, if at all possible, to ever disentangle the first and the third person. There's always some first person aspect in the third person task, and there's always some third person aspect in the first person task. I don't know if this is something that you would align with, Andre.
Yeah, okay. I have to, because usually the first person perspective or paradigm, maybe with paradigm you mean something different. The first person perspective is pre-scientific, does not require no trainings, special training. So in the context of scientific investigation, maybe they are guided in some way. So it is not the usual first person perspective, but a first person perspective informed in some way. Okay. Okay. Philippe, you want to? Okay.
Andre, yes, it's just a follow-up before Felipe's, just about this, the first person perspective or paradigm for testing. I think they are doing with the first person something like they are doing with the second person. They're going around the bushes too, because what they do is they test the third person, but there is some hint, some bit of first person too. Pretty much like they do the test third person, but there is some second person going on, and then they measure that. But I don't know exactly how they could actually measure first person phenomena directly too. This challenge may be even bigger. I mean, this might be even more challenging than actually measuring second person directly. But anyway, just gonna leave that.
No, I think this is fantastic. First, what is interesting about this is maybe I'm gonna be like extremely structuralist here, even in a Saussurean way, but it's one thing that proves clear to me in this discussion, I wonder whether you agree with this, is that it's very hard to talk about any of these persons without reference to the others. You can only understand what you know or what you don't know, what you're doing, what you're not doing about the second person by reference to what you know about the first and third person. They are sort of co-determining a system of values, right? In that sense. And then there's the definitional side of things. What would count as a first person? If you think about it from a constructionist perspective in which, and a systemic functional perspective in which the statement that you are faced with assigns you a social role. So that if I ask you, hey, do you like my watch? I'm giving you a first person role there because you have to answer me in your first person. You have to say, I like it, I don't like it, from the here and now, right? That already suffices. But I have the perception, Marco, upon hearing you, that you're thinking more in terms of the very intimate construction of self, rather than the second person as this in the ways in which I'm thinking. You seem to be thinking like, can we even access qualia? Can we even access the very defining core of what makes our consciousness specifically ours and unique? And I think that those are two different ways of construing what we understand as the first question. And I'll confess that everything that I said, no matter how right or wrong, probably wrong it was based on the first perspective. That one that's more perhaps linguistically and socio-constructionally given.
Okay, Felipe.
Yeah, so just like curiosity question. So something I was thinking when you presented the results that olfactory words activate areas involved in olfactory processing. So if you present people with the text like, and the red car sounded its horn. So imagine that you can get like some activation of visual areas and auditory areas. And people have some visual imagery, have no trouble imagining, visualizing a red car. And also with the sound of the horn, you can have some auditory imagery as well. But then if you follow the text with, and the smell of gasoline fill the air, and you can have activation of the olfactory areas, but it's so hard to get like olfactory imagery. And I'm just wondering, why is that? Is that an explanation? Do the cognitive neurosciences know why that is?
That's very, very, very interesting. The first thing I'll say is that I'm not sure that it is that hard to engage olfactory imagery. I don't know.
It is elusive, right?
Universal truth.
You like sometimes you think you're doing it, but then you lose it. It's like very elusive. Sometimes it feels like you're there, but you're not quite. It's an elusive kind of ability.
It might be. When you think about that, the first thing that one does in his little scientific mind is to try to say, okay, what's different between olfaction relative to the other senses? And if the question is neuroscientific, you say what's different neurologically between olfaction and the other primary systems. And something that comes to mind is that the olfaction seems to be the only sense that is not mediated by the thalamus, for example. When you have upstream information coming from your visual fields or your ears, or even haptical, somatosensory information, all that information is relayed from your perceptors, to the thalamus, which is a sort of relay area that then distributes information onto cortical areas. Olfaction does not work that way. It has its own playbook, if you will. So all I'm saying is that, there are some particularities that you would be able to find in terms of how olfaction works in the brain relative to the other senses. And that would be like a segue into finding perhaps an explanation as to why, if it were true that olfactory imagery is more elusive than others, that might be the case. I would be unduly speculative to say anything more than this, given that I'm not an expert in olfactory processing, nor in the molecular basis of neurocognition, which are probably important components to try to attempt an answer to this question. But then one more thing I would say is two things I want to add. First, I am doing something that's another of the sins of neuroscience, which is I'm compartmentalizing things extremely. So olfaction this, but vision that. The truth is that those are constructs, and your olfaction is tremendously intermingled with your taste systems and with your vision and with everything else that happens in your brain. Think about olfaction. When your mother, your grandmother wanted to give you medicine that was very, very badly tasting. I don't know if you guys do this in Brazil, but what my grandma used to do was she would cover my nose. And it didn't take any fMRI scan for her to know that there's something about olfaction that mediates taste. So all of these questions about specific modalities, we sometimes have apparently good answers for the modality-specific framing of the question. But then when you think about the constant interplay among the modalities, that's where the real challenges begin. And one more thing is that you said something that also exposes one of the main problems in neuroscience. You said, so you're reading this text, there's a red car, and there's visual imagery, and there's the horn, and then you listen to this, and then you say, and the smell filled the air, and then you do this. And the truth is that you're thinking about the way in which language actually works in real life, which is what's happening now. You have this unfolding stream of information that is cumulative and it's co-determining, and there are all sorts of relations that sort of build hierarchically and psychically on top of each other. What we do at the lab is a sorry-ass version of this, because we will show people individual words, carefully selected, statistically matched. Well, the best that we can do is use these texts, but then we're not looking at what happens, second after second as the person is going from this line to this other line, right? And the people that have tried to do that, they run into all sorts of statistical problems that really make the results uninterpretable. So this is the major divide between methodological necessity and ecological validity. And there are some ways of trying to strike a balance between them, but usually you are often left in the best possible scenario with a compromise, and in the most typical scenario with a relinquishing of one.
Okay, it's getting late, so if there is no further questions, I think that we have to thank you, Adolfo, for that very nice important talk. And tomorrow we start at 9:30 with Ernesto, and we will have two more keynote talks with Anthony Gomila and the closing talk with Maria Yunis and Mariana. So good night to all, and see you tomorrow. Thank you again, Adolfo.
Thank you very much. Have a great night. See you.